Good morning. I'm Mike Mazzio, Dean of WashU Olin Business School, and I am thrilled to welcome you all this morning to the Brookings Institution, including those of you who are joining us virtually this morning. We are here to discuss research findings and policy recommendations on ownership transition in private business. We'll take a deep dive into the growing wave of those transitions, the so-called silver tsunami, as baby boomers retire. This is at the core of the research that has been done over the past several months by our WashU Olin Brookings Commission. This research partnership is a powerful combination of WashU Olin and Brookings, and the work here was sponsored by the Bellwether Foundation. So today what you'll see is the results of a months-long project. Members of the commission, along with our faculty conveners, have thought deeply about ways to understand this challenge, and you'll hear from all of those commissioners and faculty today. A generous grant from the Bellwether Foundation made this work possible. The foundation is driven to improve the quality of life by supporting innovative programs that make a positive impact. Today's project is the third of 3 research projects that Bellwether has funded and supported through the Olin Brookings Commission. It's a wonderful partnership that has led to some great research insights over the years, including the work that you'll see today and the connection between research and public policy in this work has been foundational. I want to acknowledge the foundation and also thank the wonderful Ginger Smith from the Bellwether Foundation, who saw vision in this plan to tackle important societal issues through this lens of both business and public policy. So I'd like to get going by making some introductions of our research team who are going to present their findings today. So I'll ask the people to just kind of wave for those in the audience here present as I introduce them, and virtually you'll be able to see them when they come up on stage. First and foremost, I want to introduce our fearless leader of the commission. I guess technically he's called the lead faculty convener. It is Professor Peter Baumgarten. Peter is the director of the Koch Center for Family Enterprise at Olin and a wonderful colleague. The commission includes myself as well as Brendan Ballou. Brendan is the author of Plunder, Private Equity's Plan to Pillage America, and he served as a special counsel for private equity in the Justice Department. We also have on the commission Ronnie Chatterjee. Ronnie is the Mark Burgess and Lisa Benson Burgess Distinguished Professor at Duke University's Fuqua School of Business, and Aaron Klein, Brookings Miriam K. Carliner Chair, Economic Studies, and a senior fellow for the Center on Regulation and Markets. And finally on the commission, virtually joining us is Olin graduate Lynn Gorgas, who is the president and CEO of Cameron Holdings, and she's going to join us virtually for the panel and the Q&A session. In addition to those commissioners, we have 4 faculty from Olin who have been deep participants in this work, driving the research forward. So let me introduce first John Barrios. John is an assistant professor at Olin in the accounting area. We have Seth Carnahan, who is associate professor of strategy. Bart Hamilton, who is the Robert Brookings Smith Distinguished Professor of Entrepreneurship, and Margarita Chuchura, who is an associate professor of finance. A wonderful group of my colleagues on the faculty at Olin, and we really were able to, if you noticed, get a really nice interdisciplinary group of professors to look at this question from a variety of different angles, and I think that's seen in the outstanding work and policy recommendations. So I'm deeply grateful to all of your participation in this work and the hard work that it took to get everything together. And we're here to share our findings. So to get started, we have a short video to kind of set the stage. Welcome to Main Street's tidal wave of transition.
Small and medium-sized businesses are the backbone of the U.S. economy and the U.S. workforce. These businesses employ more than 130 million people in the U.S. Over the next decades, it's estimated that companies holding $100 trillion in net worth will be passed on to successors and inheritors or sold in the marketplace. This is the so-called silver tsunami.
We run a restaurant business, and I do almost everything, but except cooking. My parents doing cookings. I feel like it's come to the point they need to retire now. But the problem, the challenge for us is who is able to take over my dad's position. It's difficult to find someone who you can trust and you can rely on.
And all the companies we've recently bought, they're all my dad's age. They're the baby boomers. And many are still holding on because they don't know how to get out. Many are looking where they go next, or their family hasn't stepped up into that role. In many cases, they're not thinking bigger and they're trying to figure out transitions, and the transition usually happens way too late.
Such a significant shift in ownership, coupled with the growing prominence of private equity investment into the middle market, raises questions. What type of ownership will these companies transition into? What is the corresponding impact on the economy? How will these transitions impact the communities in which these firms are embedded?
Taking over my father's company has been surprisingly complicated, even though it's supposed to be a simple one-to-one relationship. I'm an only child, he was the only owner, I'm the only new owner. But there's still really interesting family dynamics to work through under any circumstances.
So I think when we think about transition and how it's going to impact our employees, a great deal of thought is put into every transition that's done at the portfolio level and in a leadership position about how it's going to impact the employees. Is this the right person to, on one hand, push us forward into the future and continue to innovate, and on the other, take care of our people in the way that we want to take care of them as a family business. There's a real sense of responsibility there, and we want to honor that going forward.
So what do owners actually care about in transition? One piece that comes out of our study is the fact that they care about who the buyer is. What you see here from our first tranche of owners is some level of their preference for two distinct types of buyers, that coming from the family on the left-hand side, and that coming from the employees. Other areas they're a little bit more concerned about, specifically some of the private investors or a strategic buyer, perhaps because of how it might have an implication on the culture of the firm or the strategy it pursues.
Well, a little over a year ago, we started looking at options of how we were going to transition this third generation family business. And culture was really important to me. I didn't really want to sell to private equity, and we ended up selling to a strategic, larger buyer, but a company that was an ESOP, which was really aligned with our culture and our values.
Through research and work done by the Olin Brookings Commission, we look to illuminate the world of transition. We start by codifying the strategies different investors use in this market. We then illuminate ownership preferences in transition, clarifying the trade-offs they face in choosing one path over another.
We've seen the effects of what happens to the ESOP accounts, and we see people highly incentivized when they can directly link the performance of the company to the growth in their retirement account. So I think ESOP ownership structure sets you up to have long-term motivation and incentive associated with performance.
I would very much love to move my company into some kind of ESOP structure where there's a broad level of employee ownership it's hard to get a company to grow 10 or 15% for like the 5 to 7 years or however long it takes to make an ESOP work. So if you can like grow something for a couple of years, 10, 15% rate, and then it's steady for 3 or 4 years and have some way to exact that employee ownership transition, I would absolutely like run right into that kind of offering. I don't know what policy can do to create that, but that's what I would love.
Finally, this work clarifies the impacts of various types of transitions and the strategies pursued on workers embedded in these firms. Taken together, this allows us to identify a set of policy implications stemming from our insights, work linked to reducing friction for the owners and optimizing outcomes for those workers.
Everybody focuses on public sector businesses because it's in the stock market, we all have our investments and everything. But I think the backbone for this country has been, and many of those businesses, almost all of them started off as family businesses. But yet we are so scattered and there's not really great places to learn from other family businesses. And only just now are institutions like WashU and other institutions recognizing the power of that. And I think if we recognize that power, we can drive great change across many spectrums.
Well, good morning, everyone. Again, for those of you virtual as well as those of you here, it's great to have you here. I'm Peter Baumgarten. As Mike mentioned earlier, I lead our Koch Center for Family Enterprise and have been the lead commissioner on this work. Part of the value on this kind of work is pulling together different commissioners and researchers from an interdisciplinary standpoint, but then also convening and working with people that live in the world of policy. And as a result, we have a real opportunity today, many thanks to one of our commissioners, to hear from Dilawar Saeed, who is the Deputy Administrator of the SBA. And what he'll be framing here broadly is some of the challenges that he's seen right now. Imagine the world that he's living in with disaster relief, elements around the election cycle. We'll get a pulse on what's happening broadly in that space, followed by an opportunity to be able to dig into some of those pieces of research that you just heard, pieces tied towards investor behavior, owner preference, and eventually employee outcomes. So, Deputy Administrator, welcome.
Thank you so much, Peter. And I want to thank my friend Ronnie Chatterjee, who made a call to me, I think like 3 days ago and said, can you show up? And happy to be here. It's a great audience in the room and also online. As Peter mentioned, I'll talk broadly on SBA's various policies and how we are right now responding to this moment in our economic growth. But I also want to touch upon the disaster response effort, which is front of mind for us as an administration, but also as an agency. When you look at the last 4 years, I think it's not hyperbolic to say that the investments that we've made under this president and this vice president, whether it's the Bipartisan Chips and Science Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the Inflation Reduction Act, American Rescue Package, these are investments when you all put together in their scale, in their ambition, and their impact, rival almost what happened with the New Deal. And we are seeing the impact of that building up new industries, EVs to semiconductors, and I know where Ronnie's been very involved with in implementation. And I'm a tech entrepreneur turned public servant, and I firsthand know that you have to invest in a very intentional manner to be able to make sure that you can build a future, given what's happening globally, but also given the experiences we faced during the pandemic with our supply chain disruption. There's one amazing outcome, an additional amazing outcome when you have investments of this scale happen, and that is the impact on entrepreneurship. We have seen that these investments have in part made possible a record number of new small businesses created over the last almost now 4 years. So the numbers, and they keep growing, and I don't know if the ones I have are accurate, at 19.5 million new founders have started a business. So just as we think about the silver tsunami, there's another tsunami coming of young people. Actually, a lot of them from underserved communities, minority communities, women entrepreneurs, women entrepreneurs, 19.5 million across the nation. And I travel a lot. I've been to almost 30 states, and every state has a record number of new small businesses created. And especially, frankly, in parts of the country that faced the China shock, where there was disinvestment happening. And that's the beauty of this economic recovery, that it is actually disproportionately helping the industrial belt and parts of the South. Now, how does SBA help, and why is it relevant for SBA? Well, as someone who's an entrepreneur myself, I can tell you starting a business is only the first step. You need access to resources, you need access to funding, you need advice, support, someone who can help you with your business plan, product market fit, and that's where we come in as an agency. I'm sure this audience is not a stranger to SBA. We are part of the federal cabinet. We're responsible for small businesses overall. During COVID time, we played an outsized role as an agency. $1.2 trillion worth of COVID relief went through the SBA, both under President Trump and President Biden. And much of that, frankly, momentum we've used to make sure that we are now serving the small business community. So I want to share with you a couple of key priorities for us to make sure that as we see this entrepreneurial stimulus, I use that term, SBA is there to make the most of this. So one on the lending side, which is really a core product. We did $54 billion in fiscal year 2023 in overall lending across our 7A loan, 504 loan, these are working capital, fixed asset purchase and so forth. This year we expect to actually beat that number. But there are a couple of reforms that we have put in place to make sure we are democratizing access to capital. And I'm just going to pick two just for the sake of time. One is expanding the network of lenders to include lenders who are banking in underserved communities. Because one of the lessons learned during the pandemic was that, frankly, the first batch of COVID relief didn't reach underserved communities. If you may recall, some of the big banks were the first ones that were giving PPP loan. And we realized they were not banking with the Black community. They were not banking with rural entrepreneurs. So last year we made 142 mission-driven lenders. These are CDFIs, these are community banks, these are regional banks, who bank with communities like the Midwest in rural parts of the country. SBA license holders. What that means is now they can disperse loans that SBA will guarantee, and we plan to continue to build on this. This strategy of expanding the lender network to include regional and community banks has never been, frankly, as big a focus at SBA before, so very proud of that. Second, we focused on making sure that there is a greater small dollar lending taking place as well. I was surprised to know when I joined the administration that an average SBA loan is often north of $500,000. I think that's great for many small businesses that they have the scale to be able to have a loan for working capital of $500,000. But if you're starting out, you need $20K, you need $30,000, maybe even less than that. And the banks would tell you, well, I'm sorry, it takes me the same amount of time to process a big loan versus a small loan. Why would I work on a small loan? And that created a, frankly, behavior where the banks are not talking to the small entrepreneur. Well, we're in the business of enabling the next generation of entrepreneurs, especially those who are coming online, in the last few years. So we made some intentional reforms that did not involve Congress. It was just our own statutory authority as an agency to simplify the loan process down to literally 2 pages now. We also took a lot of the technology, using technology in our headquarters, doing the fraud checks, underwriting, and at the SBA. The result of that is our small dollar lending is up 47% year over year. Now, I want to make a point, and someone who's an operator turned public servant, this is a quiet work of government that does not make headlines in all the noise that you see 24/7. But this is real impact happens. The fact that you can go in and you have now a greater chance of being able to get a $20,000 loan in a matter of days and make sure that you have that you can pursue with your entrepreneurial dream. So we're very proud of some of these efforts to make sure that we are truly democratizing lending to underserved entrepreneurs. Some of the results that we have seen in the last 2 years in a row, and this year will be even better than this, what we saw last year. Our lending to the Black community was $1.5 billion. It's a record number. Our lending to women entrepreneurs is almost 2x since the president took office and the vice president took office. And same goes on with many underserved entrepreneurs. Government contracts. I'm not sure if you all know this, that SBA is actually responsible for ensuring that federal government contracts are awarded to small businesses in a fair share. The U.S. government spends $700 billion a year on buying goods and services. It actually makes us the world's largest purchaser or largest customer. It's bigger than the GDP of some nations. And SBA has a mandate. Part of my job is to ensure that small businesses get their fair share. So last year, we had a record 28% of all federal government contracts went to small businesses. In addition to that, the president made a very, I would say, solemn promise that he wanted to see 15% of all federal government contracts go towards socially and economically disadvantaged businesses. These are Black entrepreneurs, women entrepreneurs, Hispanic entrepreneurs, Asian entrepreneurs. In fact, he made that promise, and the reason I use the word solemn, he made that promise against the backdrop of the Black Wall Street anniversary. As you all know this, race massacre, the burning down of the Black Wall Street in the Greenwood district in Tulsa, Oklahoma. He traveled there in 2022 in January and said at the 100-year anniversary that we are given a painful past, we want to divert an important resource of our government spending towards Black entrepreneurs. I'm pleased to share 12% of all government spending on contracts went to socially disadvantaged businesses, including Black entrepreneurs and Hispanic entrepreneurs last year. This year, the goal is to get to 13%. And if we have a chance to work on it next year, it'll be 15%. Again, these are real dollars. This is a serious amount of resource. And there are two means to make it happen. One is an 8A program. By the way, a lot of government programs are with alphabet, so something that I've gotten used to. But 8A is a program that is a procurement vehicle designed for minority entrepreneurs. Frankly, we face some judicial challenges against many of our race-conscious programs. We've made sure this program is up and running, complied with the court's injunction, and in fact, it's grown to make sure that it's a fast track for government set-aside. Let me shift to disaster, and that is front of mind for us. Many folks may not know this. Small Business Administration is one of disaster response federal agencies. We get deployed alongside FEMA every time there's a presidential declaration of disaster, or a governor declares disaster, or we as an agency declare disaster. You're seeing the headlines coming from Florida. It's devastating. What we see at Milton, it is genuinely historic. And we keep using this word, but unfortunately, given the extremity of the climate, the standard gets raised. As we speak, SB is deployed around the country in 35 disaster response. We have 100+ folks currently deployed in North Carolina, in Florida, and I'll be visiting North Carolina and Florida early next week. And it's been obviously a core focus for us. Just a couple of things to share with you. There are two programs that we have for disaster. One, if you're a homeowner, or you're renting and you're impacted, or you're a small business owner, if you're impacted by disaster, SBA makes loans available up to $2 million for small business owners that are impacted by disaster, and for homeowners up to $500,000. A couple of reforms that I think are worth noting. One, we made some changes in our disaster relief effort that that you can use some of these proceeds to also make your business more resilient. For example, if your HVAC is impacted, maybe this time you can use some of the proceeds to raise the ceiling so that it avoids flooding in future. And that requires some training, working with entrepreneurs on that, and our teams get involved with that effort. Second, just given obviously some of the higher prices that we have seen in the market, we raised the amount of loan that doesn't require collateral for homeowners. So $50,000 you get right away without submitting a collateral. By the way, the interest rate for SBA disaster relief loans, if you don't have credit available elsewhere, is 2.8%. So this is genuinely helpful, right? Especially in this environment. And this is where an effort where we work with our FEMA colleagues, we work with our local district offices, and make sure that folks have the support they need. So in conclusion, let me say this. I shared with you just a few reforms that we undertook over the last almost 4 years to make sure we are reaching communities that are underserved for our funding or with respect to a disaster relief effort. These reforms reflect the values of this administration. I genuinely believe that policies are a reflection of values. And the values of empathy, caring, compassion, especially those who have been historically held back, has been the front and center of this administration. And the work that you've started, quite frankly, is just only getting started, given just both the opportunity with respect to entrepreneurial stimulus, but also the challenges when you look at the instances of disasters that we're seeing in the country. So with that, thank you so much for having me. I know this was a broad overview. And I do want to say, finally, I should make a point that your work on the transition of businesses, 50% of almost employer firms are in that bracket is critical. And it's going to help inform some policy in our firm. So we look forward to collaborating and learning from you. There is a tool that we can use from SBA as well. Our 7A loan product can be used to acquire a business. And we were just discussing earlier with Peter and Ronnie that how we can think about how to make sure that there's greater awareness of that, and we can simplify that, just learning from your experience to see how we could be a collaborator in the future without making policy promises from the stage. With that, let me end. I'm happy to take a couple of questions. There has to be questions. Go ahead, please, Ronnie.
Can you talk a little bit about when SBA is deploying these disaster areas? What are you exactly doing? What are the big challenges there vis-a-vis? Oh, sorry. Thanks for your comments, Laura. I wanted you to expand a little bit on what SBA does when they're deployed in the disaster areas. And the fact that you're working on 40 other disaster areas at the same time, how do you keep your personnel sort of in the right place at the right time, given how stretched you guys are right now?
Absolutely, and good question, Ronnie. So, our product is disaster loans. These are low-interest loans for homeowners, for renters, and for obviously small business owners. What we do is we actually open what we call business recovery centers, BRCs, and they open right. Either sometimes they are co-located with FEMA's disaster recovery center. So we actually have people physically show up, set up a table, and folks can walk in. So right now in Asheville, for example, the city of Asheville, we're working with the mayor's office, and we have a BRC located at the center of gravity in Western North Carolina. You can walk in, get your file your application, get your questions answered. By the way, you can also do this online. But a lot of these folks, quite frankly, have lost a lot of things. They often don't even have access to internet. And so providing an ability for them to have a direct conversation with the government personnel, get support, get help, that's something we do. And that's sort of so we have a surge capacity, if you will. We deploy people. And to your point, when you have so many disasters happening right now, and as we speak, we have a fourth hurricane that's named just in that part of the country, this requires resources. And I think this is all public source, but you all have heard about the funding situation. While this might be inside baseball, but the reality is, without funding, which is the United States Congress's mandate, we cannot deploy these people, whether it's FEMA, whether it's SBA. And there are people right now who've lost everything, and they need support, they need help. And frankly, this is a resource they're paid for. This is taxpayer-funded resource. It's not FEMA doesn't get a budget from nowhere. It is the taxpayers' money. So it's only the right thing that we make sure that it's available. So yeah, our work is we deploy our teams there to help applicants with their applications, and also to coach them, if you will, with respect to how to rebuild and do recovery. And a lot of times our BRCs are there for months. And I want to make this point. This is not just in the moment of disaster. We stay on the ground for months. In case of Maui, where I actually went there right after that devastating fire almost a year and 3 months ago, we very recently still had a BRC. Because that community, for months, you couldn't even go inside to see what to do. And again, that's something folks don't understand, the complexity and how long-term the recovery could take. And SBA has a role, throughout that time. So good question. Thank you.
Thank you. One of the things that we've observed in our community and at Olin is the strength of veterans as entrepreneurs and acquirers of businesses. Can you say a little bit about what SBA has done to facilitate ownership for veterans?
Excellent. By the way, in addition to disaster, the most gratifying part of the SBA mission is serving our entrepreneurs who are veterans. They have the grit and they're the right people to start a business. We actually have a very strong entrepreneurship program for veterans. There's also a goal when it comes to federal government contracts, 5%. We actually doubled the goal from 2% to 5% of all federal government contracts for veteran-owned businesses who are service-disabled veterans. There's an entire office that actually supports veterans in terms of assistance and guidance and mentorship advice. You may have heard of veteran business opportunity centers, VBOCs, that are open across the country. I think there are 31 of them in the nation where you can walk in as a veteran, get assistance, make sure if you have any questions about your loans that you've applied for SBA, you get help, or just overall advice and getting connected with other resources. So it's a big part of our program, and we work very closely with the VA as well. On the tech side, we actually launched a new application called Vet Cert. You can get certified to be a veteran-owned small business online, and we actually cut the time from it used to be months to now almost 15 to 17 days to get your certification done. By the way, that's a near record in government speak, because that doesn't happen that quickly. Huge focus on it, right? And that's something we obviously celebrate, and very proud of the effort. And of course, more work to be done. And we see also in this new wave of entrepreneurship that we are seeing, a lot more veterans also coming online to start a new business. Yes, please.
Thank you. One of the most exciting things that I heard you talk about is reducing the application page down to 2 pages for some of these loans, because my mother is a single mother. She started a small business when she was 40, and I think one of the most terrifying things for her was having to deal with bureaucracy, whether it's government bureaucracy or bank bureaucracy or whatever it happens to be. And I can imagine, not just the fear, the anxiety that, is produced by having to go through all these sorts of hoops. It just stops so many people and prevents them from finishing. So can you talk a little bit about how you guys are thinking about reducing the bureaucracy, the application process for some of the programs that you're talking about now?
Absolutely, it's a great point. And look, first of all, there is actually an office, an initiative at the SBA where we look at regulation and we see how, writ large, and see how we cut red tape. And frankly, we should be talking more about this. And that's not a narrative that comes out. But so much of our work in a program is to make the program simplified. We're not necessarily launching new programs. We're making the existing programs more accessible and simpler. That's my ultimate pitch. And more reachable in communities that often didn't reach, in part because they were just so terrifyingly difficult and complicated to engage with. Now, in the same breath, I also say this, and I say this with full respect, that every time you engage on a government resource or you're benefiting from government resource, there will always be more scrutiny. There'll always be a little bit more paperwork because it is a public good. These loans are made available through our lenders. They're backed by SBA. And it's a public finance product, right? So it'll be extra paperwork that you see in a commercial market, but it's available in a market where commercial market doesn't even open its door. So we are across the program offices, our capital access program, our disaster response program, our government content program. We are constantly looking at how do we cut the paperwork. There is an ombudsman office. She has our associate administrator there. She is going around the country, having roundtables, getting feedback from people. We take the feedback in, see what we can simplify. It's also part of the President's Management Council. I sit on that where all the deputies get together and we look at across the board, what are some of the low-hanging fruits that we can just make things simpler, easier, these forms that are easier. There's also a digital track to this. So, that's the world I come from, a tech entrepreneur. How can we make things simpler as we go on a digital track? Now, interestingly enough, during COVID, SBA had to go in the cloud very quickly. A lot of the work was done online. That became a good impetus for us to use technology to simplify some of those things. So this remains a priority. I would say it's more of a horizontal, to make sure that everything that we offer is simpler, easier to, use and understand. Also multilingual. Frankly, I saw in some cases we weren't even translating in Spanish some of our disaster work. And there's a lot of work to be done, that in terms of making sure that things are simpler and easier to understand and they're reaching everyone. And again, it remains a work in progress because there is such a breadth of resources and programs that offer. But that is a key priority, and we will keep working on this as we move forward. Good question. I have to unfortunately run, but thank you again for having me, and look forward to engaging with the community in future. Thank you.
So with that said, what I'd love to do is to now transition into the structure of our findings and its implications around policy. And what you're going to see in this work is we have basically 3 different stakeholders we're going to take a look at. One is a broad look at the investors in this particular marketplace. Second, we'll look at the actual preferences of employees owners in that transition. And then finally, the impact in particular on the employees that are going through those transitions. Out of that, we'll identify a set of policy bundles that will speak broadly towards these sorts of issues. But what you'll see kind of across our discussion here is even though the policy stuff is at the end, it'll in many ways be cross-pollinated throughout our discussion here. And the reason we can do that is we have amazing commissioners and researchers who spend their lives thinking about these issues, from both the work that they do as investors, the work that they do as owners of businesses, and in particular, the work that they do as researchers who look at this space directly. So with that said, I'm going to welcome up our first set of commissioners for this work. We have John Barrios joining us. We have Ronnie Chatterjee as well, and then we are joined virtually by Lynn Gorgas, who lives in the world more directly as an actual investor. So great to have the three of you here today.
Recording in progress.
And the recording is in progress. So what I would love to do is to actually start to think about this from a couple different angles. And again, I think we have the benefit in this space of having someone who does the actual direct investment. We have someone who sits in the world of policy and also in the academy and Ronnie's work, and then John's work in particular at looking at this from an academic standpoint. And so, John, I'd love to start with you. You've looked a bit at the world of private equity investors and others in this space. And I wonder if you can speak about the role of private equity in competition, and whether or not you think it might apply broadly to also the investors in the lower and middle market in that work.
Well, thank you, Peter. Well, I want to build off kind of from our survey where we started off asking investors' perception of kind of the strategies being utilized in this middle market. And interestingly enough, in terms of the perception in terms of PE deals in this area, you see even more weight on add-ons and roll-ups in this space. And that kind of brings in questions about competition. And so my work looking at kind of PE in deals that get kind of caught up in Federal Trade Commission disclosures, they kind of end up not meeting the bar for disclosure, which facilitates some type of kind of anti-competitive, where you could imagine you end up all of a sudden with having one owner for all 4 or 5, car washes in an area, and then that has implications for pricing and the local consumers. And now you throw in this tidal wave, basically a huge supply of mom and pop businesses that end up having to look for a buyer, and that kind of makes for kind of a perfect storm potentially for this anti-competitive behavior from PE. There are plenty of studies that kind of have documented in kind of renal clinics, consolidation of renal clinics, consolidation of small, doctor practices in anesthesiology, gynecology, where you end up seeing kind of the push to kind of cost savings, but also potentially prices start being elevated, whereas we don't see much any benefit in the quality part. So these are things to think about as we think kind of long run of what does it mean to have all of a sudden, hundreds and thousands of businesses on the market looking for buyers, and then becoming a bigger player in this middle market segment.
That's great. And what I'd love to do is to give you a snapshot on some of the research that was just being mentioned by John in this space. So what we did is we built upon a study that was done in 2016 that you see highlighted here. And what it broadly did as one piece of it is it went out to about 79 different investors and asked them, out of these different potential levers that you can pull, cost reduction, improving incentives, follow-on acquisitions and the like, what are the ones that you pull? And so you see this highlighted in some of the colors, the one that they say they do most often, hence what do private equity firms say they do. It was a survey-based research. Things around improving revenue and demand, incentives and the like. And then some of the ones that ended up on the low end are less likely to be involved in this space. Now, part of what we looked at in this research was to say this was now about 8, 9 years ago, 10 years ago when you look at when the data was actually collected. These also tend to be really large firms doing pretty large investments in this space. And so we were able to go out to about 30 folks in and around the investment space and to say, what do you see today in the lower middle market, similar to John's point, that's similar and different? And so we're able to, again, look at these same levers and to say across these different types of investors, whether a lower middle market investor, whether a family office, and we'll hear from Lynn in a short bit about how a family office might invest differently, a strategic corporate, or perhaps even shift into employee ownership, as you saw in that video, whether or not the frequency that they would use these particular levers might vary. And so at a high level, what you see there is some of the differences by these different groups as perceived by these investors. The numbers in green mean that they think it's going to happen more often, hence John's comment around perhaps even more aggressive behavior on some of those lower middle market pieces. The numbers in red a little bit less frequently. And so again, you see this broken out, same data, just two different tranches. Differences between, again, the lower middle market, which has a certain profile of investment, pretty similar to what you would see in the larger investor. The strategic corporate, perhaps less likely to do some of the follow-on acquisitions or bringing on a strategic investor. And then pretty significant differences when you actually talk about the family office investor and the ESOP. So family office investor seems to be a little less oriented around cost reduction when compared to those investors, maybe a little less likely to change up the senior leadership team. And then ESOP even less so, those numbers even dropping a little bit lower. So in some ways, John, maybe as a quick follow-on point, when you think about these different categories of investors, when it comes to the competitive behavior, would you anticipate differences in terms of how they might engage and whether one might be better or worse for competition?
Yeah, I think the incentive structure for PE is you get in, you change a little bit, you either add on, and then you try to exit big. I don't see any way of changing that type of incentive structure for PE. And then once you get into kind of family offices, a strategic buyer, or even in the employee plans, there you kind of think of more of like long-term investment in the business. This high, like the high exit probability, I think, is where we kind of see this distinction between kind of private equity and these other potential investors. And it's clear from the survey, at least from the employee perspective, and you see kind of in our video, the beginning is more of this orientation of we want to maintain the culture and the ownership of the firm. So it's not about big changes in terms of the business model or the structure, is how do you create the continuity through a next generation when you have an owner that needs to step back and kind of liquidate from the business while maintaining that business in the long run.
That's great. So Ronnie, I'd love to make a shift to you and to hear how you think about the investment landscape as well. And as we get into the policy landscape, what we're going to be talking about a bit is whether or not there's certain behaviors on the part of the investors, perhaps some more long-term oriented or perhaps even tied towards employee ownership, that might be worth incentivizing. So again, you see this landscape up close in some of your work and academic work. I wonder if you can speak a bit towards what you notice in this space and its potential policy implications.
Well, yeah, first I just want to say thank you to Peter and the Olin Brookings Commission, the Bellwether Foundation. You know, for me, working on this report with the great research team has kind of highlighted a grand challenge that we're facing in this country. You know, when I walk around the halls of the business school at Duke, and I'm sure it's the same at WashU at Olin, students are really interested in solving big challenges. And so the grand challenges in business schools often have to do with climate change or AI or political polarization. But I guess I'm going to encourage for the students out there in the audience and watching, this grand challenge about demographic shifts is actually really important. And sometimes it's not always discussed when we're thinking about the big things we should tackle in terms of starting a new business model or entrepreneurship through acquisition or the kind of companies people want to work at. So at least for me, I think this commission and the work, and I think it's going to be ongoing, has gotten me to focus on a grand challenge that's having a tremendous impact on our financial markets and the economy. And so I look at the investors on this slide. You know, you have different types of investors with different incentives. And my sense is, having been someone who's worked in policy at the White House and the Commerce Department, done academic research on entrepreneurship, probably the future is going to involve all four kinds of these investors being involved in this transition. And the question is, what levers are we going to pull to try to provide stronger incentives and also protect against some of the downside risks that you're talking about? In government, we often find that these things have trade-offs. Often when you make something tax advantaged, you create sort of more incentives for behavior for a particular investor, maybe to acquire a business. The deal will now pencil out in a way it wouldn't before, but you're also going to create tax advantages. And often, if small business owners represent sort of one slice of the income distribution, there's going to be equity concerns about how you design that as well. This is something we got to think about when we do these kinds of policies. I'll also say, you know, a lot of folks, I think, who study the ESOP and employee stock ownership plan model, they talk about information asymmetries. The idea is that this market doesn't work because the two sides haven't been brought together. There's some sort of information friction going on. And so if we believe that, then we have to think about practical ways to create a market here. So if there are buyers out there who have long-term interests and there are owners out there who have long-term interests, why aren't they meeting the market? Why aren't they matching? And if you believe that there's an information problem, well then, you know, government can play a role, but there's also lots of private and nonprofit philanthropic efforts that could create better information and be almost like a matching service. And so I think we need to think about, as we go deep in this research and we get the expertise from people in the audience and on Zoom, what are the real frictions out here and how do you think about it? All these investors are going to have trade-offs, pros and cons. And if the market's not working, and we do nothing, this silver tsunami is going to be something, a man-made disaster that we're not really prepared for. And as I think about my reflections going forward, I'm going to try to figure out what the unlocks are in all those categories. I think one thing I'll focus on in terms of the area I'm watching close is employee stock ownership plans. It's been really interesting to see private equity firms, KKR is one, and form organizations, and Pete Stavros has set up a separate organization from KKR called Ownership Works. And so it's companies like that are looking at the space in a new way. But there's efforts all across the board. And I think trying to figure out kind of what the best in class is across those four investor types might be a really interesting way to go. So that's my initial impressions, how I'm thinking about it.
And just as a reminder to the group, we'll have an opportunity at the very tail end to bring back all the researchers and commissioners. So if you have questions, please do hold those to the very tail end. Now, Lynn, I'd love to go to you and your perspective. You represent a type of investor that I knew very little about until a couple of years ago when I took over the Koch Center for Family Enterprise, and that's that of the family office. And there's been more and more language around family office doing direct investment work and the like. So I wonder if you might be able to speak broadly to what's different about the family office model versus others, and whether it might explain some of the differences on the levers that you might pull versus that of a more traditional ESOP or private equity investor investing in the same business.
Okay, well, thanks, Peter, and good morning, all. Three things come to mind when I think about what might be different in terms of family offices versus other investors. The first one is, and this goes right to what John was saying, we do not have a predetermined hold period for our investments. So private equity funds, as you might know, have usually a 10-year, and they end up selling their operating investments in 3 to 5 to 7 years, regardless of what might be the optimal time for the company. We're very flexible on that, and actually the first company that my family bought, we bought in 1978. We still own it. Another company we bought in 2000. So I'm going to say those are definitions of patient capital. The second thing is kind of aligned with that. We provide the equity in terms of the capital for a company, but we also provide some of the debt often, and that's in the form of sub-debt. So instead of going to a third party or a mezzanine fund or sometimes a bank, we provide a slice of the debt in the form of subordinated debt, and we're very flexible with current interest, term, and also covenant violations. If a company gets into a little bit of blip in terms of earnings, we're flexible on that piece of the debt. The third and probably most important thing is, as a family office, and I think most family offices are very lean when it comes to professionals with manufacturing operating experience. So we rely heavily on the managers that are there at a company day to day, have been there for a long time. And if we're looking at a company to acquire and a lot of the key managers want to leave, it's a huge negative for us. We want the managers to stay. We hope that they invest alongside us. We incentivize them along the way with equity so that their investment grows with the value of the company. If a manager really wants to leave, he's been there for a long time, or he's the founder, we ask usually that there's at least a 1-year transition period, so we can identify someone to take his or her place and then groom his successor. Then I go to family office conferences a couple times a year, and there's often a panel, Peter was saying, on direct investing for family offices. So that is, instead of going through a private equity fund, family offices look to acquire their own operating companies directly. And then the question is always posed, well, who's going to get the call either in the middle of the night or on a weekend if there's an emergency of the company? If there's a fire or a large customer leaves, who's going to get that call? And the answer is we have to rely on the managers that have been there a long time, the key employees who know the market. we empower them to make decisions, and then we're a very nimble group and a small group that helps them make larger decisions.
That's great. I want to make sure I didn't cut you off there, Lynn, at the very tail end. I felt like you were about to make the perfect comment to close, in this sense.
Even private equity funds now, the big ones, have operations people that take a role at companies often, but family offices really don't do that. We're leaner.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, we're going to make a transition now into looking at the second tool, the second way to think about this from a stakeholder standpoint, but really appreciate the three of you and your insights along the way. Thank you. So I want to transition now then to think about the second stakeholder. Again, our hope is that we look at it from a couple different angles, and also in conversation with folks like you all that are both in the room as well as virtually. In fact, I've reached out to several people that are there virtually saying, what's your take on these findings? What's been your experience from an investor standpoint or from an operator standpoint? And so in this third space, what we have an opportunity to hear from is insights around ownership. And so I'm going to welcome back to stage Mike Mazzio and Bart Hamilton. And then also Carrie Smith from Inova. And broadly on this piece, one of the challenges that we have in the context of studying privately held firms is a lack of data. And so as a result, the way to get that data is by partnering with groups like the following. We had an opportunity to work closely with Inova International, with Edward Jones and US Bank. The data that you see in the full report actually reflects two of those capital partners, with US Bank still in deployment. So the updated report will include another tranche of business owners that speak to those particular companies. But really grateful for the opportunity to work with these three organizations to get some insights on the core business owners. So let me give you a few of those insights, and then we'll hop right into the panel structure. But in the midst of this work, what we did is we went to current business owners and we said, we're going to give you an opportunity to choose between two different investors. And we asked this a series of times, because if you ask people generally what their preferences are, do you care about your employees? Yes, of course. Do you care about your communities? Of course I do. But the broader question is, are people willing to take the trade-offs in those choices? Are they willing to take a potential haircut on the deal in order to actually get the kinds of outcomes that are needed? And so as a result, we can vary these dimensions: time horizon of the investor, strategy for the company, what they might do from a culture standpoint, their actual financial offer, and then the types of buyers, as we just heard on the last panel. And then we make it like this. We are able to say buyer one versus buyer two. Here is the comparison between these two groups, which over the course of about 200 owners in this, and eventually closer to 450 at the very tail end, what you'll be able to see is the aggregate preferences that come out of those choices. So imagine 200 owners, that's 2,000 choices, 400 owners, 4,000 choices. And you're able to say, on average, what actually drives those choices, one versus another. And so this is what you see from the data. In other words, the most important factor, not surprisingly, and also a sign that they're actually paying attention to this study, is the fact that the financial offer makes a great deal of difference. All right, they're going to pay attention to the offer that's made. Not surprisingly, the most important on that is plus 15%. They'd love to get above market value on their business. But the other factors, including the nature of the buyer, the time horizon, the strategy, and the culture, in aggregate can make a difference that overcomes the actual financial value of the firm itself. They might be willing to take a different, lower offer if they have the right type of buyer, the right time horizon, and an approach towards strategy or culture that aligns with how they think about this work. And then you see that broadly in the midst of these choices. So as you saw in the video on the upfront piece, the preference, at least in this initial tranche of data, was towards someone in their family taking over the business or buying the business, or potentially towards their employees, and a little bit more concern specifically about the other three buyers, most acutely the competitive buyer, in part because we would argue some concerns around what that might do to the culture of the firm, the legacy of the firm that they built over time. And you see investors responding to this. Oftentimes an investor like Olin might speak broadly towards how they might maintain the culture through key leadership or choices that might make a difference for the firm itself. And then broadly, what's the biggest concern? Well, the biggest concern broadly is also tied towards cultural change. And so you hear here this idea that I want to maintain the culture on the left-hand side. And I'm a little concerned that this buyer might actually significantly change the culture that deviates what I built over time from where we've been historically. Strategy matters a bit as well, but not nearly as much as culture. And then from a time horizon standpoint, you see that also being a preference slightly towards the longer time horizon buyer, as you've heard from some of the permanent capital comments that we've heard from Lynn. Now, with that said, I'd love to turn it over, Carrie, to you first. You live in this world as a person who's directing some of the research work at Innova, and I know that you had a question for Mike to kick us off.
Yes. So, Mike, in your book, Roadside MBA, you spent a lot of time with businesses that are similar to the businesses Innova works with. The smaller organizations, a lot of family-run businesses, and thinking about the tensions and the pain points that you encountered with them, how much of it was related to general operations, transitions? Did that vary by company size, location, age of owner?
Yeah. So the work that I've done in this research has been very field-oriented, spending time getting to know and talking to owners in this space, and just kind of reflecting on it a little bit. One of the things that that is very clear is if you're thinking about an owner in transition, you've already got a really strong survivor bias in there, right? We're not talking about businesses that are like brand new. We're talking about businesses that have been around, that have grown, that have stood the test of time in one dimension or another, and as a consequence, they are here to transition. There's a lot of success embedded in that, and the observations that we made kind of over the years and spending time with these businesses is that often that that survivor bias and the source of the success is rooted in the owner, founder, leadership team of the organization. This is especially true in industries where relationships and where trust is essential for kind of the success of the business. And as a consequence, when you're thinking about transition, there's a big question of how those relationships are going to carry over, and how an organization that a business that has trust with its customers, how is that going to change when the owner is not involved or the management team is different? And so it's not just having a different person with a different strategy to take over, but what is that individual specific human capital that's developed and then become kind of complementary with the other elements of the business? How can that manifest through whatever transition mode is optimal in that case?
That's great. Well, I'd love to turn it over to you, Bart. So I know you've done some work in particular on one of those preferred transitions. So as you see that research, it talks about the fact that one preference is not just for the employee side, but the ability to pass it on to one's children or someone inside the family itself. And you've done a bit of research empirically on understanding what makes those transitions more or less functional, more or less optimal in some ways. So I wonder if you can speak to that and its potential implications for what this might be from a policy or business owner standpoint.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. One reaction that you might have to what we saw with owner preferences to selling their business or transferring their business to another family member is, well, this means this is great, but we're going to sacrifice some performance when we do this, because we're going to have a family member potentially running the business, and maybe they'd not be as able as a non-family member CEO. And we studied hundreds of these transitions, and one thing we forgot, this is kind of amplifying something that Ronnie Chatterjee had said, is that one of the real advantages that family owners have, and when it comes to choosing a new CEO, is that they know a lot about the fit and the abilities, the motivation of family members coming in, say generation 2, generation 3, running the business. It turns out a real cost to firms when they're hiring a new CEO or a new leader is that there's a lot of uncertainty about how good a job they're going to do. And unfortunately, it takes a few years often to learn whether or not this person is a very good leader, very good CEO, and so forth. And once you learn that, as anybody who's gone through this, any business owner who's gone through this, it's very difficult to get rid of a poorly performing CEO. So one of the real advantages we find in the work is that family owners have a very strong informational advantage when it comes to knowing how good a fit a family member will be as CEO. So even if they're slightly lower quality, I don't want to use that word, that's kind of a loaded word, they're actually a lot less risky In particular, hiring an outside, somebody who hasn't worked for the firm, is an incredibly risky move for a firm to make when they're hiring a CEO. And this also relates to the point you saw about the preference to selling to employees. Again, employees, people who are promoted to leadership positions from within, the firm, again, the family owners often have a lot of information about the fit and the quality of that person. And that means, again, this is a much less risky kind of ownership transition or leadership transition. And so, again, that's something that hasn't been emphasized very much as an advantage that family-owned businesses have. That's part of the reason why family-owned businesses often outperform non-family-owned businesses, because they have this informational advantage about the quality of the people they're able to hire into leadership positions.
And Bart, just so we put this study in context, was this done with large public firms, smaller firms? Give us a sense on what the data was.
That's right. As we mentioned, getting data to study family businesses is very difficult. So this is larger or publicly traded firms. So these are bigger firms that also tend to have more leadership transitions in a shorter period. There's also, as I said, often large costs in making these changes.
It's one of the things that I've heard several times in talking to leaders that are in these types of firms is the need for cultural continuity from a strategic standpoint, and the ability to be able to find the person who might be able to, again, have the competence level needed, but also the ability to bridge that gap over time. Now, I want to go to one final piece on this that I think is relevant, and I'm going to pull in some other research that speaks to this, work by Nick Bloom at Stanford. So Nick has done some work using the World Management Survey, something that Margarita, our next colleague, will speak to a bit as well. But what we have here is a study that looks at the professionalism of different types of organization, using typically a 20-item scale that's assessed from the outside when interviewing these companies. And you see differences here in terms of the dispersed shareholder public firm all the way down to, I love to tell my entrepreneurship colleagues this, the bottom, which is the founder-owned, founder-CEO, least professional firm out there. But nonetheless, one of the things that Nick finds both in this work as well as some follow-on work is that, first off, choices that are made by the firm can make a difference. So you'll see there family-owned, family CEO versus family-owned, non-family CEO. So imagine someone who can maintain the cultural continuity, but perhaps is hired in to drive a certain level of professionalism in the firm itself. But he also looks at this in the context of education. And so one of my favorite studies that he's done looks at access to executive education, or in this case, managers with MBA type courses. So both MBAs, executive education, and the like. This is in the context of healthcare administrators. And what you see is a pretty significant difference in terms of the professionalism of the firm itself as driven by education. So access to education and the like. Now, Mike, I'm curious, you are in a role of leadership.
I mean, seriously, like, let's put this on a billboard somewhere. Sorry.
That was off script. Peter? That was off script here. So what does this imply for business schools? We have several people here that are in business schools. We have people here that are in the education space. We have people that are in companies that provide loans that think about education. SBA talked about education as well. What does this imply for the American business school?
Well, I think what we really feel like the opportunities are almost endless in terms of connecting this space with the education that we provide. We need to, in the academy and in business schools, do a much, much better job at speaking to the needs of this community through our research, through our teaching, through the case studies that we kind of bring to students. But I've seen over and over the acceleration of a lot of businesses when maybe it's in the next generation. The kids are they're getting an MBA, they're coming back to the business, they're combining with that knowledge and experience and trust of the original founder or owner, along with the kind of family culture, and the business just accelerates to really exponential, in some cases, growth. And so this is one of the reasons why at Olin, the Koch Center for Family Enterprise, we feel like that space can be a real catalyst for private business, kind of combined with professional business education to a greater degree.
Great. Well, thanks to the three of you for joining us. Carrie, again, thanks for all the work that you've done from a partner standpoint to be able to give us the kind of insight. So,
thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, grateful for you. So I want to go to the final stakeholder, and what we'll do is we'll walk through some of these results as well as get some insights. I'm going to welcome to the stage Margarita, Seth, and who is joining us on the final? Yes, Brendan Ballou. So one commissioner and two of my colleagues from WashU joining us here during this time. And what we'll be able to speak to is what we see from the employee standpoint. So again, focus one was on how do people see the investors across a number of different categories. Focus two was broadly focused in on what do owners actually want and how do they navigate the trade-offs when considering a potential offer. And then finally, how do we think about the insights from the employee perspective or the labor perspective? And so for this work, to give you a sense on what this is, all of this is outlined in the full report, which is available on our website, available for you all to download. But I'll give you at least some snapshots in this. What we looked at was employees that have gone through a transition at some point in the past, in the last 5 years. And we were able to assess them, their recollection of their jobs, the quality of their jobs, on multiple different dimensions. So some of which was tied towards a DOL construct around both competitive wage and benefits, being valued and respected by leadership, and transparent promotion and advancement opportunities. I've always found that this is this interesting tension that we have around small business. We love it. We're going to talk about this with Aaron in a bit. We love small businesses. They have bipartisan support, and yet sometimes the jobs aren't that great. And so one of the things that we need to pay attention to is, does the job get better? But then a series of other measures around meaning and purpose and culture inside the firm itself. And then what we were able to do was to look at those over time. So what was the quality of the job prior to the transition? And what you see here is a mapping of a year prior to the transition, 6 months after the transition, and then 1 year, 2 years, all the way through 5 years. What you see there is, again, a dip for those that left. We don't know if they're dipping because the job got so worse, or perhaps that's shaping some of their recollection there. But broadly, that you have an impact on transition on all employees. There's a dip for both, but most acutely for those that left. They're more likely to leave the organization or perhaps be asked to leave the organization. Now, relevant to our discussion here, what we have as well is differences by these different categories. And so what you have now is transitioning into different types of ownership forms, transitioning to employee ownership forms, different forms of family, so generational transition or perhaps a member of the family buying a share of the company, transitioning to a competitor, and then also to an investor group as being the four that we explored. And what you see is, again, generally dip for all, other than employees. Employees tend to stay relatively high across the board, don't have as much of a transition gap there. You do have a dip for the other three categories, and then some improvement over time with, again, at the very tail end, having your private equity investor second on that list of four, family just behind that, and competitor near the bottom. Now, this was the aggregate measure, so we looked at these elements together as one composite score, but we were also able to break it down into these particular individual components. And so the key takeaway on this slide is the fact that the job quality, self-described job quality, seems to recover quicker, but measures around purpose and culture seem to be a bit stickier over time. The company feels different, the culture feels different. I don't have the same kind of meaning in my work as I used to based on that transition. So again, as we think holistically about what makes for a good job, those are things to pay attention to as we think about the meaningfulness of the work itself. We were also able to look at the investor's perspective from the employee's insights. And so we asked them, what are the levers that are being pulled, going back to that same list that we saw in study number one? So here you have, for example, the question of, are they reducing costs? Are they improving IT? And these different types of buyers afterwards. So a lot of information there, but what we're able to do is to say it's not only the perception of the investors, but also the perception of the employees that are experiencing this. And most importantly, what I'll highlight is that we were able to ask this, I think, important question, which is independent of who's doing the transition, what strategies matter most for employee outcomes? So I think too often we approach these large asset classes like private equity or all ESOPs as being the same. The reality is they're very different. They take very different approaches. Even if we were to cluster together Lynn as a private investor with a more traditional middle market private equity fund, they would have different approaches. And so as a result, we were able to say, independent of the transition that you were coming from, the ownership before, and what you're transitioning into, what was the impact on these particular strategies on your composite measure of well-being or job quality? And so again, we control for the stuff at the top, what you're transitioning into. We control for the stuff at the bottom, and we really focus in on what are the changes that matter the most. And so the ones that are in color, and in particular in color red, are the ones that make a difference. Those that are on the right-hand side, to the right of that dotted line, make a positive difference on employee outcomes for these 500 or so employees. The ones that are below that dotted line are the ones that have a negative impact on the employee experience that were significant. And so just to kind of summarize that back with our initial table, the most negative impact, at least from the employee perception, is that cost reduction, perhaps even short-term cost reduction approach towards investment, coming in and cutting costs. Now, again, we don't know if this has an impact on the company performance. We do not look at company performance directly, but from an employee experience, that matters quite a bit. And the ones that seem to be most positive from an employee experience are the ones that are highlighted here in orange. Right, so improving some of these legacy IT or information systems that have been outdated over time. Finding ways to actually improve some of the corporate governance, and then most notably, the ability to kind of improve incentives. So hence why you might be seeing some of the incentive structure of the ESOPs or other employee ownership models starting to pop there in terms of positive outcomes. And so what this allows us to do broadly is I think it allows us to say, independent of the investor, what are the types of behaviors that we want our investor classes to be doing? Because I think Ronnie's spot on that all four of these categories, as we looked at in the front end, are going to be involved in this marketplace in some way moving forward. And so might we think of things that we want to see either in the education that we give to these investors or the policies that surround them in the work that they do. And so what I'd love to do here is to be able to explore some of these issues with our team who approach it from a research standpoint, from a policy standpoint, and the like. And Seth, I'd love to start with you with a broad question. You study issues of labor, you study issues of talent inside the workforce. When you think about what makes for a good job, and in particular what makes for a good job in transition for some of these firms, what comes to mind for you?
Thanks a lot, Peter. So I think the kind of framework you described earlier, Peter, is what really guides a lot of research and a lot of management thinking in this area. So what's a good job? I think we all have an opinion on this. The best job you've ever had, probably something where you feel like you're paid fairly for the work you're doing. You have bright line path to promotion, more responsibility, and you feel some kind of autonomy and some kind of trust from the leadership that you're working with. And so I think here, and you can kind of see this underlying model coming through in the data that we've collected, and also in other research that's been done broadly in this area, where for employees, transition, part of what is so difficult is change is really hard. You know, it doesn't matter whether you're being bought by a private equity company, a strategic buyer, even a new family member taking over a business. I mean, having a new boss, new direction is difficult. And here we think about these different buyer types, and you can think about how the strategies that these buyers might have in mind might affect these job quality dimensions and what we think about as being a good job. So, for example, there's a fair amount of research that shows that when private equity companies buy firms, the wages tend to go down a bit on average, and turnover increases. And there's a lot of churn that happens with these types of buyers, where there's a lot of people leaving, a lot of people being laid off, but also a lot of people joining. And so and you can see how this fits with the strategy of these types of buyers, where they're buying the business because they have some idea about how the business could be changed to increase the return on their investment. And so for employees, you know, this creates change that then is difficult and could push down some dimensions of job quality. You think also kind of back to what John was saying with some of these buyers, if their strategy is to roll out a business model across multiple branches of the same kind of business, the same kind of industry, that's going to entail some kind of standardization, some scripted behavior that is going to push down this autonomy piece of job quality. And so you can see like some of these strategies that investors might have. For them, this is the kind of the playbook they have, that they want to increase return on investment, but it could push down job quality for some employees. And we see similar kinds of patterns in data, not just with private equity buyouts, but any kind of merger and acquisition where you have a new type of player that is buying a company. They have some idea about how to change the strategy, and this has implications for employees. And I think something that's important to highlight here is, we talk a lot about the U.S., but we see this pattern in research studies that are well done using data from Germany, using data from France, where you have this real tension between what employees might want out of their job and what investors are hoping to, the changes they're hoping to make to the business. And finally, I think one point that's interesting here that we don't necessarily get at in our data, but we think about who is change hardest for. And the answer typically we find for older workers. And so in our sample, we're asking folks on prolific which is a data platform where we can survey folks about different transitions they've had. Most of those folks are probably younger because they're they're using this web platform. And what we find in other studies is that these transitions, these ownership transitions, are especially hard on older workers. Because if you think about the new strategies that some of these buyers might have for these organizations, it's often upskilling for workers, bringing in technology, to Peter's point. And these kinds of changes, I mean, I know I can even feel it now. I'm pushing 40. I'm technically young, but I'm feeling old. Now I have to adopt new tools in my research job, and I find I'm feeling this pressure myself. And so for older workers especially, you see bigger declines in their employment rates, in their wages, and so on when you see these kinds of transitions. And then a final point here is that most of the research that we have is looking at comparing, say, private equity buyers to strategic buyers, because we have data on that. And I think what's cool about what we've been able to do here is we're asking employees about other kinds of transitions, like when family members buy the business or take over the business, or employees take over the business. And we really have very little data, very little information about what those transitions look like for employees. And so I think that's something for us as a research community that I think is exciting going forward, is to understand not just employees' recollections of what these transitions are like when, say, an ESOP takes over the business or a new family member takes over a business, but what that looks like in hard data for employees' wages and turnover and job outcomes and so on.
That's great. I'm now a little bit worried about updating Seth's outlook at some point in the future, because it just might dip his productivity for a period of time. No, of course not. Of course not. So Brendan, I want to transition to you. Brendan is one of those people that's impressive to me because he has a really big day job and then finds time to write a book on the side. And in particular, your book was looking at the private equity space. And so in a short bit, we're going to talk about differences in the strategies that might be pursued by these investors, whether or not there might be longer-term orientations that might reduce some of the negative consequences that could be in this space. But would you be able to speak broadly towards what you saw in your book and then its implications perhaps on whether or not there are certain strategies that might be more or less optimal when it comes to the labor standpoint?
Of course, thank you. And I should say, of course, that I'm speaking in a purely personal capacity. And apologize a little bit. I've developed a mid-career interest in getting migraines, so I apologize if I seem a little bit out of it. But why don't I kind of set up the basic sort of critique that I've laid out on the private equity business model, and then try to get to the second half of your question here. So, I think when people in the popular press have criticized private equity, they have often focused on the people that are running the private equity firms. And I think that is generally a mistake. The people that I've talked to in private equity generally have been very committed to their businesses. They take their kids to soccer practice, all the normal, they're normal folks. But we have a lot of legal and regulatory incentives around the private equity industry specifically that I think incentivize oftentimes short-term extractive tactics. And let me lay out sort of three incentives here. One is something that Lynn alluded to earlier on an earlier panel, which is that private equity firms tend to invest for a few years. That's 3 years, 5 years, 7 years, whatever it happens to be. And how long you invest in something changes your perspective on it, whether you're going to invest in infrastructure, in IT, or whether you're going to engage in a cost-cutting endeavor. So that's one problem. Second problem is that private equity firms, as many of you know, tend to use a lot of debt to buy up their companies. This is debt that the acquired company has to pay, not the private equity firm. And the private equity firms tend to make an increasing portion of their money through fees extracted from their portfolio companies, which is something that I'll get back to in a moment. And then the third problem, and this is what sort of interests me as a lawyer, is that private equity firms have been extraordinarily successful at insulating themselves from liability for their actions of their portfolio companies. So if something goes wrong at a private equity portfolio company, you can sue the portfolio company. It will be very hard to successfully sue the private equity firm, even if the actions of the portfolio company can be attributed to the strategy of the firm. And so when you combine all of those basic problems, short-term thinking, reliance on debt and fees, and insulation from liability, I think that tends to create a sort of heads-I-win, tails-you-lose sort of business model where private equity firms are very good at capturing the upside of the deals, but because of the laws and regulations that they benefit from, can often walk away financially when things go wrong. So let's get to the second half of the question here. When can things go right? Because I don't want to imply here that every private equity deal is going to go south. That is certainly not the case. But I think that there are some incentives that could be tweaked here. So let me give you an example. Private equity firms tend to be compensated on what's called a 2 and 20 model. So they're entitled to 2% of their assets under management every year and 20% of the profits of their portfolio companies once they reach certain thresholds. So if the company they buy makes $100 million, they're going to get 20 million of that. The challenge is that while they get 20% of the profits, they get 100% of the fees that they get. So management fees, which are paid every quarter, every year for the privilege of being owned by the private equity firm. Transaction fees for when the company sells off large assets. And so what that means is while they get 20% of the fees, they get 100%, 20% of the profits, they get 100% of these fees that they often get for engaging in cost-cutting measures. And so sometimes you have an incentive structure in the way that these private equity firms organize themselves that they actually have an incentive to extract money from the business because it helps themselves, even if that ultimately hurts the long-term profitability of the business. So where I have seen private equity firms succeed, not just for themselves, but for their whole communities, for their employees, for their customers, for their fellow investors, I think it's when they turn down the knobs of those three problems that I talked about a little bit, when they think a little bit longer term, when they invest more with equity rather than with debt, when they take on more responsibility for their actions of their companies. And just to wrap this up, I think one of the success stories that I saw was when a private equity firm decided to reinvent or revitalize a timber mill in Northwest Arkansas. They did it by investing for a multi-decade period, by making a solely equity-based investment rather than loading the company up with debt, and really sticking around for the long term. And this was a deal that revitalized a whole town, and the mill is still going. So I think that there is certainly a role for private capital play, and it can play a role that is helpful not just to itself, but to employees. But we've got to have the right legal and regulatory structure surrounding it if that's going to happen.
And that's Brendan with a migraine. You should see him without a migraine. It's incredible. But I'd like to close out this section, Margarita, by looking at the labor perspective again. And in particular, this tension that I've been wrestling with. On the one hand, we love our small businesses, and at the same point, we know the jobs are not always great, the opportunities for advancement, many of the things that Seth mentioned are not always there. And so in transitions, whether from a family to family or family to employees or family to investor, it seems like there's a potential to professionalize the organization. And so I know you've looked closely at some of this data and have been involved in some of the World Management Survey work as well, but can you speak broadly to where that potential might lie and what it might imply for policy?
Thank you, Peter. So when we see family business, we all love them, but when you see the professional, they don't run the business in a professional way most of the times. And that can affect the quality of the jobs and employee satisfaction. For one hand, you think about HR practices, less professional, less clear the path to promotion, less clear the wage setting. And of course, there is the glass ceiling. Employees know they might not get the top position, which of course affects their morale and satisfaction with their job. Less adoption of IT technologies, as well if you think about family conflicts, leaving the family table and coming to the business. On the other hand, though, around transitions, as our study shows, and prior studies have shown as well, is that family transitions and employee transitions have an advantage of keeping the culture, having an advantage of transmitting the soft assets of the firm that is so hard to move from one generation to the other. So how can we strengthen kind of the weak parts of a family transition or employee transition? And to understand that, I think that's where the survey of Bloom and prior work has been very helpful to understand what are the frictions, why they're not adapting these policies. And it seems that the frictions, of course, on one hand can be for small businesses, liquidity constraints, but for all sizes of businesses, it seems to be information constraints. Business owners, they don't realize they're behind in investing in IT, in new technology, and they don't fully understand the connection between improving these aspects and that what can do to the bottom line. So information. And the second is bandwidth. They are so busy with running the business day to day that they don't find the time to do these changes. And I think that's where this is kind of important, where the academy and where the government could help the businesses by trying to see how can we fix the information component, how can we have education, how we can have intervention programs to improve this professional aspect of the businesses, because we see from the studies that even short programs, a few months of trying to give them more tools to use in there and professionalize the business, they do make a change and a difference for the bottom line.
So those informational gaps are then are able to be closed to some degree by virtue of education, of awareness. Those are the things that start to, and then I guess time to some degree, time to be able to do those. Those become some of the key pieces.
Yes, and I think delegating is always hard for business owners and trusting other people to do it. And that's also kind of a learning process. And of course, make them realize kind of more the connection between bringing new IT, especially for older, but I think even for younger generation, in as business transitions, we do less good job into preparing the successor to be ready to have the tools to run the business. Yep. It's too late a couple of years before the transition. This has to be done quite a few years before.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, you hear some of this piece outlined by the deputy administrator when talking about these two waves, one wave of retirement and another wave of people that are interested in ownership. I know that at Duke, at WashU, at Penn, and other institutions, one of the big interests is the ability to kind of hop in as a new individual owner into those ownership roles and perhaps to potentially professionalize the business in that transition. Great. Well, thanks to the three of you for the opportunity to engage in this work. And again, as a reminder, we'll have the entire group here available at the end for questions that you might have. But I want to welcome to stage now Aaron Klein to join us to think about some of the policy implications of what we've been outlining here. Fast forward through the slides. So in the report itself, you're going to see a number of things that have been identified in conversations with policy leaders. And this is where we move from empiricists into people that are kind of interacting with people like Aaron that are in the policy space. People that are in the Small Business and Entrepreneurship Group or the Senate Finance Committee, they've been very helpful in showing spaces where there might be alignment with existing policy or policy opportunities. And what you broadly see in this space is kind of 4 bundles that are outlined that we think are relevant for people that sit in the policy landscape. And in particular, it's these 4. And we're going to start by outlining it, and then Aaron and I will have a bit of a conversation talking about where you see potential, where your excitement sits in this space as well. But the first piece is broadly hitting at the idea of how do you make it something where it's actually attractive to hold this business. One of the things that comes up quite a bit when talking to business owners is that competition's difficult, more intense. It's hard to find the right labor for the job itself. And so there are things, commodity pricing, rising commodity pricing. There is a series of things that are outlined in our report that say, how do you make it more possible for the small business to compete with the larger players so that the existing owners aren't being forced into transition, but they're doing so when they're ready to transition out of this business itself. And so bundle 1, dealing with this idea of making it more attractive to actually hold this business. The second bundle that you're going to see is outlining this idea of a dual purpose ownership model. And so one way to think about this is actually that perhaps the family firm or the employee firm, by virtue of being embedded in a community, might actually have a certain kind of dual purpose in the work that they do. In the work on family business, this is often described as the socio-emotional wealth driver. So not just the financial wealth driver of owning the business, but the things that are a little bit more softer when it comes to the motivations for ownership. And so family firms might have a certain kind of blend of these two motivations. But importantly, there's other models that are a bit more formal. So for those of you that have been following this space for a while, Patagonia's transition into a 501c4, whereby the ownership, the financial ownership of Patagonia's profits actually sits with a charitable foundation that serves a certain kind of environmental purpose, is a novel innovation trying to say, here is the commercial part of the Patagonia business, but serving a particular charitable end. There is a precedence for this that kind of extends prior to Yvon Chouinard, and this would be Hershey. So if you've followed Hershey, Hershey as a business model is about 30% owned financially by the Hershey Charitable Trust, which distributes profits to a particular school in that community, Hershey, Pennsylvania, and 80% of the voting rights or the control is actually held by that charitable trust, and it's performed relatively well in that model. But that model is now kind of blocked beyond 20% by the 1969 tax code. So saying, are there ways to actually increase or to create more opportunities for this dual purpose model is a second piece. Third bundle deals with the employee ownership side of our work. And so when you think about this, one part is tied towards how do you increase the ease of transitioning into a certain kind of employee ownership model. Several investors and owners identified the potential challenges of doing so. So you hear this a bit in Eric's comment from Anova, not Enova, but Anova Furnishing, talking about how he's drawn into this as a second-generation family business owner, but doesn't know if it fits for his business at the current size and scale that they're at. The same could be true for Corner 17, the restaurant group that we saw as well. So finding whether or not there are ways to kind of increase the potential for these businesses to transition to ESOPs, and then also to increase perhaps the imagination and incentives for the investor group, as Ronnie mentioned earlier, to think about folding these things into the deals themselves. So as you're hearing innovation around ownership works, there are some pieces in that space that are identifying, saying, or asking the question broadly about whether or not there might be spaces to increase employee ownership in that investor structure. And then the final piece is really starting to think about the long-term behavior of the investors themselves. So if there is a difference broadly between short and long term, when you think about one core mechanism for doing so, it's our capital gains tax structure, but that's the difference between less than a year and more than a year. And when you think about an investor that's broadly oriented around a 6-month flip of a business versus an 18-month flip of a business, both of those are quite short term in orientation. And so we have a series of policy discussions at the very tail end of the report that are saying, are there things that you can do on average to make the investor more likely to be thinking about the kind of longer term thing that we heard from Lynn, that we heard emphasized from Brendan's work as well. So Aaron, great to have you here. I'm gonna now transition to my chair. But I'd love to hear from you.
I think you're on this one.
Am I on this one? Yeah. I took the wrong chair, I think. When you were looking at the data, first off, what stood out to you? And then when it comes to either these policy bundles or others, where you see opportunities for policy innovation?
Sure. Thank you. This has been a pleasure and a joy working with you and fellow commissioners. The thing that jumped out to me most about the data was the view of, and this was from the Enova data and the other surveyors of folks who are business owners, people don't want to sell to their competitor. The competitor ranked below private equity. And I think this is very important to understand because we tend to believe, and if you look in the report, they talk about measuring in utility, which the economist in me loves. And then we tend to do this little sleight of hand that utility is equal to dollars. And so we just kind of substitute those two things out. But when you actually talk to real people, there's something I once referred to it in a paper I wrote as the economics of spite. And anybody who saw the Curb Your Enthusiasm season will show that, like, people really value spiting people they don't like. In fact, negative emotions can be stronger than positive emotions, as those of us have found through social media. And so what you find is people don't want to sell to the person they've competed against locally. And often in smaller environments, that's the natural local competition. So you kind of have the outside external investor, individual, or private equity as a fund. You have within the business, the family or the employees. And then you have this third group, which is like the person who you've been competing against your entire life. And that's the one you don't like. Even though there's an economics, particularly as you think about the economies of scale in smaller towns, et cetera, and that competitor is assumed to be, for these purposes, kind of local. So the value that we're trying to continue to capture from a policy perspective of keeping local ownership and keeping this transition within the community bumps up against this natural tension that's been occurring. So that was kind of the biggest counterintuitive finding that I think, and this is why directly talking to the owners is so important, and not just observing actual transactions. So I think that was one. The second part you did, what jumped out at me when you're looking at all this legislation, is how bipartisan this issue is. As somebody, I worked in the Senate 8.5 years, and you don't see an issue as bipartisan as small business, but also as this kind of transition concept. When you look through the legislation, the report looks at it, you see chairs of committees with the Republicans, like Chair Shaheen in small business and Senator Cassidy. You see folks like Senator Cardin and Daines. You see Senator Van Hollen's out there. There's a lot with Senator Rubio. There's a lot of bipartisanship around this. So no one here knows the outcome of the election is going to be in a month, and if you really do know, please tell me after the event. But we do know is that this is coming. This tsunami, this transition is coming, and we do know that regardless of who wins the election, both sides are interested in addressing it. Both sides are starting to find common ground, and it makes me optimistic that the policy, the door for policy change to occur is opening and is going to be wider in this space than in almost anything else.
That's great. So I want to first off put a point in what you just said there, and that was around the fact that economists aren't real people. It was some sort of reference there, very subtle, but I just want to highlight this for my economist colleagues. But the second piece is you made a reference to the fact around localized ownership, or perhaps that there's maybe a benefit of having ownership in particular communities. So whether you're in Maryland or Missouri, what's your view on that as a North Star to be targeting towards? Is it something beneficial on average when you have more ownership of those firms based in the communities? And if so, why?
Yeah, so I think the answer to that is one, yes, it's true for more than just states that begin with the letter M. Two, for why, I think that depends on the area you're talking about. The area I'm most familiar with is financial services, which the SBA deputy administrator alluded to earlier. Right? If you think about, there are financial services that are deeply commoditized. Credit cards, right? There's a form, you fill out the form, you get the situation. But then there's a series of things like small business loans, where a lot of prospective borrowers don't fit a box, or put a different way, local information about knowing who this person is, who their family is, why that business will or will not succeed, provides value. We've all walked past that place where the restaurant just doesn't seem to work, and it keeps churning every 6 to 8 months. And you can suspect that the local banker is going to be like, yeah, if you want to put a restaurant in there, good luck with that. I've seen 10 restaurants fail in that. But the other hand, they're going to see a person go, you know what? I saw your last 2 businesses work. And even though you don't fit the credit box that's easily commoditized and distributable across, I think you're going to do a good job, and I'm willing to put the bank's capital at risk here, and I have an information asymmetry. And this is a massive competitive advantage that America has, right? America has almost 10,000 banks and credit unions. Right? And we have this not because that's an economically optimal number that we've reached in equilibria, but we have this because we used to have 15,000 banks because you couldn't bank in multiple states before the mid-1990s. When I teach in the classroom, kids don't believe me. They think Bank of America always existed all across America.
They no longer heard of the 90s, though, to be fair, so that's a shift.
It's a retro decade, but if you look back, right, Canada has 6 banks. France has like 6 banks. England and Germany are considered to have a lot of banks, and they have about 180. Right? We're in the thousands, almost 5,000 banks, almost 10,000 banks and credit unions. And that gives us the ability to funnel capital in places that just don't work to a formula. And so that is a massive comparative advantage. And so you ask why in a North Star. Like, one is just the knowledge that is within a community that is lost. 2, I think culture matters. I love Wawa. I love shopping at the Wawa. I love going to the Wawa. And I asked myself, when I fell in love with the Wawa, I didn't realize it was employee-owned. But it was just such a better experience. And then you go back and you realize that family built, they do things in a different model. And that model works wonderfully. And so I think that there's a value created from the consumer experience. there's a value in the economic culture, and there's a value for mobility. The last point I want to make is an employee point, which is that the American dream is to climb the ladder and to have some amount of ownership, an ownership society. And I think that a lot of the reforms we're doing is about democratizing ownership. And the stock market model of democratizing ownership, I think, is a failing model. It's a 20th century model. It's a model that isn't working when you can take companies in the modern era and go massively large without ever going public, and where you're finding more and more of a winner-take-all economy. Even as economic platforms ought to democratize success, you're seeing more things come up in a winner-take-all world, and this allows employees to benefit in that. At one point, the ratio of CEO to janitor pay was much more narrow. The social and cultural norms that kept that have disintegrated to a large degree. You can fight to bring them back. That's kind of, I'm intellectually with you. The hill that you're climbing there is pretty steep. Or you can say, how do we make sure the janitor owns a little bit of this company? That, to me, feels like a much easier path to try and reduce the wealth and income inequality and create greater opportunities for folks across the employee pay scale.
And one of the things that Seth and I were chatting about at dinner last night is the potential risk of having too much of your ownership concentrated in a particular company. So imagine my pay is with company X and my ownership is with company X, and that's great if company X is doing great, but I might actually want to have diversification across an index fund in different ways. So how do we think about that side?
Look, that's real. I mean, sometimes when you work in financial regulation, you measure your career by crises. So my first crisis was Enron and the financial accounting crisis. And there are lots of stories of folks who were partners at Arthur Andersen and lost a tremendous amount of their wealth because that partnership model, they had nothing to do with the group that was doing the Enron accounting in Houston and Texas, and they got wiped. And you see that also, with folks working on Lehman Brothers and other companies that Fannie Mae and other things that failed. And there's some truth to that. There's also some truth that you got to keep an eye on your business, and if you're working for a business, you got to believe in that business, and you're up and down. I think there are other ways that folks can diversify. Home ownership, for example, a house is the number one financial asset for most Americans, not their 401k. And so the issue of diversification is real. It merits value and study, but you can't have it all. And you have to ask yourself about trade-offs, and you have to give people the opportunity, and the folks that want to put their opportunities and concentrate a little more is there. And then you have to ask about corporate governance and checks and balance. But we used to have a lot more partnership societies. Investment banks used to be partnerships. Now they're publicly traded, right? You got law firms, some accounting firms, not as many as there used to be. Medical practices, but again, we've seen private equity roll up. We've seen other business models. Healthcare is a bit of an odd sector. But you have to ask yourself, was society better off when there was more partnership model, or the flip side of stock ownership model, where I'm managing your company, but I'm not nearly as invested? A lot of folks take the argument, to which I'm highly sympathetic, that the financial crisis was in some ways created because investment banks ceased to become partnerships, and they became publicly traded companies. So the partners had all cashed out of the major investment banks when that change happened in the late 90s, and then they didn't mind. Their firm went bad. It didn't end there. So there's a push and a pull, a yin and a yang to that same flip side.
So let me do one more question here, and then we're going to pull up our researchers and our commissions for the last 15 minutes to talk through questions that you all have. But I am curious about Policy Bundle 4. So incentivize to encourage, Policy Bundle 3. I'm going to focus in on the employee side. I know you would like 4 too, so maybe we can do both. But at the very least, when we think of employee ownership, we oftentimes think of ESOPs, but you also do mention things that are non-ESOP based employee ownership, including partnership model. So is it both increasing the ability for an owner to move into an ESOP and expanding the other types of employee ownership models that are in place? Are those the two pieces that might allow those owners to get what they at least seem to prefer?
Yeah, since you started with 4, I'm going to jump into it, and then I'll answer the question. Look, we are stuck intellectually with a 20th century view about time horizon of equity in the stock market, right? The average ownership of a stock, I think, trades in minutes. Stocks are bought and owned in the publicly traded market either by passive index funds to whom there's complete passivity as long as you're in the index, right? This is your ultimate in diversification, which if you take it to its extreme means that we should just self-perpetuate the existing allocation of capital ad infinitum only to be altered when an indices reweights. Or high-frequency trading. And we then thus believe that these stockholders are the ones holding management accountable when you're either a computer algorithm trying to extract tenths of a cent like the thesis of Superman 2, to date myself even further, which I think was also Office Space for a more modern audience.
Slightly more modern audience, I think, yeah.
Or you're going to have a total passivity in this situation. So I think but yet we seem to have this theory of a firm that's rooted that there's a bunch of shareholders who are carefully reading 10Qs and holding management accountable. The second point is we have a narrow set of concepts of ownership driven in large part by a tax code. When you work in the Treasury Department, you come to realize, 1, the IRS has a really hard job. 2, everybody wants to pay fewer taxes. And everybody's trying to strategically reorient to try to game the tax code, which is only periodically updated. But ultimately, we have this very narrow concept of for-profit, not-for-profit, government kind of buckets. That's something. And when something tries to straddle multiple buckets, the system kind of begins to break down. And when you're looking at things, when we say for-profit, the belief is your profit maximizing is your sole objective, which makes me wonder why anybody buys stadium naming rights, right? There's a lot of other objectives going on in corporate America. Then you have nonprofits, which immediately makes you think that you're possibly maximizing for your community and membership. Well, I work in the financial services space. Do you know how many nonprofit credit unions are buying stadium naming rights? The NFL field. We're the DC team by the CIA's credit union. What the heck is that about for $50 million? How's that maximizing the benefit for the CIA employees who work in a different state an hour over? Right? These are vanity projects. Right? So, or something sketchy. But the point being here is nonprofits are sometimes behaving in a quite for-profit manner. So what the core question is, there needs to be a rethink at a more fundamental level of how do you create a tax code and a corporate ownership structure that benefits the things that we share in our bipartisan values, involving investment in the community, involving long-term horizon, right? Involving extracting maximum economic value in the broad sense of the world, not just in for-profit, and incentivize that type of ownership structure that also creates opportunities for the employees. And how do we, and sadly, I think we would make massive progress if we just eliminated the barriers in the existing system. So that it's a 2-stage process. 1, eliminate the barriers in the existing system, of which there are many. 2, insert new carrots to incentivize new things, and then hope they don't get gamed.
I'm glad I accidentally started with Policy Bundle 4 because that gave us some good insights along the way. But what I'd love to do in this final section, we have about 13 or 14 minutes to go, is I'd like to re-welcome back up our researchers and our commissioners. And we'll have an opportunity, again, 200 or so online, in addition to the folks that are here, to be able to hear the questions that you have for the team. They could be general or they could be targeted towards a particular person, and I will deflect any questions towards me over right towards Aaron at that point. So thank you. So we are watching the chat for questions here, and then my colleague Jennifer is walking around with the microphone so that we can hear online.
Thank you, Peter. Thanks, everybody. My name is Jack Moriarty. I lead a group called the Lafayette Square Institute. We're focused on policy opportunities to mobilize capital to build broad-based wealth, which is why we're big fans of employee ownership. My question is about sort of the buckets of the different investors, right? You talked about private equity and family offices, and then the ESOP. And reflecting on those buckets, our experience has been that the traditional ESOP is really not an investor, right? It's a retirement plan. But typically, in a typical transaction, there is no third-party investor, capital provider coming in. And so what you see are these substantially seller-financed transactions. And in addition to some of the constraints on price for an ESOP transition, you also don't get the liquidity at closing. So you have this structural disincentive for a seller that, based on some of your preliminary findings, might intrinsically want to go in this direction, but the economics don't work for them. And so this is, there's an opportunity, I think, to create the conditions where family offices, private equity move in the direction where the economics and the returns can make sense with some of the right tools in place. Aaron mentioned the Senator Rubio and Senator Van Hollen's legislation is one example of that. So I'd be curious for how can we think about investment policy to try to move the capital markets in the direction of creating scalable long-term employee ownership?
That's a great question. I'm gonna volunteer Ronnie for this one. What do you think, Ronnie? Take the first round.
Well, first, thanks for raising this issue. I think for a long time I've been following ESOPs and wondering why they aren't growing as fast as you might expect. And when they first came out of my radar, and I read a lot about them, I was expecting to see a chart 20 years later and it going straight up. And obviously they've grown slower. And I think there's real frictions in the transitions, and you're identifying some of them around the cost. And so to the extent the legislation can make a difference, I think it's a good opportunity. I do think the bipartisan support that Aaron noted and you have with the Rubio Van Hollen bill is like a really good start as well. I think the challenge is usually these pieces of legislation, in my experience, get packaged with a bunch of other things, right? And I imagine this particular legislation would be packaged, let's say, with a broader tax package where there would be a lot of things going on, or another set of policies. So that's, I think, the hardest thing to think about in terms of where it goes and how it's placed. But I think in principle, this is the kind of thing we're looking for, right, in terms of trying to reduce the frictions to ESOPs as an option. That's at least how I've been thinking about it.
Lynn, I'd love to pull you in on this question as well, because there's a reference to how family offices in particular might be able to engage in some pieces tied towards employee ownership. You and I discussed this a bit in terms of your own approach strategically in an investment, on how you think about carving out a set of equity for the employees that exist inside the firm. But when you think about the implications for the strategy of a family office, what comes to mind for you?
Let's see. So a couple things. We, as I said, we often give managers at the start the ability to invest with us, but then over the years we might, I'll say, run out of equity. So we incentivize people with, it's basically phantom stock, or we call it, or change of control units. But those are taxed at ordinary income. So it's really just a bonus at the end when there's a sale. So I would love to see something that allows those units or that particular type of equity taxed at capital gains. I think that would be helpful to people. We've never sold to an ESOP also, to the questioner's comment. It just hasn't made sense to us. So I'd love to see some legislation around that, making it more attractive.
That's great. Other questions?
We've answered everything. It's very exciting.
Thank you. So what's next in terms of research? What other topics are you all interested in going forward?
Yeah, I'll speak to it at least from the perspective of the center and the work that we do at the business school. And then I'm curious for those that are here, many of you spend time in and around this space. So I think that a big project for us at the center is also looking at this idea of the patient capital long-term investment space broadly. So to me, several questions that get stirred up in the midst of this is, what does it mean to be patient in one's approach to investment? How do you balance the rigors of thinking about the upside of actually having to create the kind of cost reduction that's inefficiency in some of these businesses, and yet at the same point find ways to do the kind of long-term hold stuff that you see from Lynn and others. And so I think broadly exploring the landscape of how different firms are approaching this. I too am very interested in the work in the ownership works space. I'm not yet sold on the model yet, but I'm curious to look at whether or not folding in more employee ownership does drive the value expected. And I would say secondarily looking at family office structures in particular. So if you don't have to kind of raise a pool of capital and then show a certain kind of IRR in your investment by selling it off, does it enable a different kind of investment behavior on the part of those investors? So those are a few areas that we're looking at the center, but curious for others that stand in around the space.
I'd just say one thing that I think many of us are very interested in is how do we get more underrepresented minorities involved in business ownership? We have a number of these businesses, obviously with the silver tsunami that we've talked about. How do we encourage more and enable more Black entrepreneurs, Hispanics, et cetera, have the opportunity to buy a business? Because those groups, especially African Americans, are incredibly underrepresented amongst business owners.
Some of the relevant work I'm doing, part of it is understanding how ownership affects the type of employees in terms of getting top talent in businesses, which I think for small businesses, getting and managing to keep top talent is a challenge, as we have the superstar firms that kind of attract our top students. And some other work I'm doing more in the US is thinking about this transition that happened during COVID of a lot of people going to more flexible work and entrepreneurship, and following this using administrative data to understand, kind of follow these businesses, understand how they're performing, who are these new entrepreneurs, how does it change the landscape of business that are created, and what are the viability and the dynamics of these new businesses.
Okay. Ronnie, from your perspective?
I was just going to say two things. This excitement around entrepreneurship through acquisition that we're seeing in a lot of business schools. So I think Delaware mentioned like kind of matching the silver tsunami with this other tsunami of all these students who are interested. We should name this, by the way, something like
Double Tsunami,
Gen
something
Z
better,
Tsunami
something
or
better.
Tsunami, something like this. But we need to match up those groups and think about this in terms of an opportunity. And I'll just steal one of Seth's and hope he'll add a little more to this. I think from a research standpoint, it'd be really interesting to work with a partner from an economics point of view to think about multiple deals being on the table and how people choose. Because the challenge as an academic studying a lot of this stuff is people say they want a lot of things. People will answer in a survey and say, I like this, I like this, I like that. Seth mentioned this. But if you actually give people choices and look to see what they choose, and if you can do that experimentally, as we've done in many different areas of our research, you can really start to find out how much people value the different priorities that they're talking about in the survey. And through that, man, we could design much better policy and have deeper insights. It's obviously very, very hard to do because you need a situation with real-life entrepreneurs and owners, multiple offers. But there have been things done analogously in other industries and in labor markets. And so I feel like that's like a really big opportunity from the research side. I don't know, Seth, is that what you have in mind when you talked about it early on?
So those that are in the audience or maybe watching online, I know that there are really interesting businesses in this area that are brokers that match sellers and buyers in these markets. And so if there's brokers out there that have data and they'd like to contribute to our understanding in this space, we would love to be able to compare the choices that business sellers make when, like Ronnie was saying, they're confronted with multiple options from multiple buyers offering multiple different types of deal terms. So when real money's on the table, do we see the results that we saw in the pie chart that Peter presented earlier, where maybe 40% of the value is financial and 60% is other things, or do people behave differently when real money's on the line and not in our sort of hypothetical survey, which is a important first step but imperfect.
Yeah, let's go with one more question. And then, John, I know you had a comment as well about some of your research, too. And then we'll go to the final question here.
Yeah, so just piggybacking on this is kind of my space is on the information frictions in these markets and search costs. And like a lot of the stuff ends up being that people just don't know what's available out there. So a lot of these things, coordination, and especially in like meeting buyers and sellers together, is about having information in a timely basis. And with advances with the internet and technology, might that alleviate some of these frictions, and we might see more employee ownership, knowing like that you could use SBA loans to actually to fund an employee ownership plan. That kind of information that might not be out there might be, a first step. Might not solve everything, but I think it's a critical step.
And let's go with one final question. Yes.
And I can piggyback off of that exact comment. My name is Steve Storkin, Director of the Employee Ownership Expansion Network. We believe the number one reason there are not more employee-owned companies is lack of information around the forms of employee ownership. And so it's our mission to change that through our state centers for employee ownership, not trying to do an advertisement. But we believe that the information and lack of education on those resources is vital to getting this done. The second thing we believe Jack brought up is lack of access to capital. And the third would be tax policy. And I guess my own personal opinion is they go in that order. My question is on the policy side. Canada, 4 months ago, decided after many years of trying to get employee ownership as a thing in Canada, said we are going to try a 2-year pilot. And the first $10 million of capital gains is tax-free if you sell more than 51% of your company to your employees through an EOT. What are the chances of that ever happening from a policy standpoint, from changing the tax code? As you said, tax code doesn't change overnight. Do we continue to try to push down that path to, because if we get the information and education about there, we have to also incentivize large deals for large purchases to happen to make a real big difference.
So I hope not. Who's going to pay the gains tax? My kids? The debt? Us in ordinary income? I mean, there was a crazy left-wing guy named Ronald Reagan who taxed capital gains at ordinary income in 1986. Now, our kumbaya as a commission may be over this, and Lynn may reach through the screen and throttle me. But, extremely wealthy people don't pay that much in taxes, and we trip all over ourselves to lower their tax breaks even more to try to humbly ask the billionaires to provide more by taxing them even less as a pittance. Now, if you had higher, if you close some of the loopholes that exist in carried interest and other things, if you raised some of the taxes that, create situations where Warren Buffett pays less as a share of his income than his secretary, and other famous examples like that, perhaps. But maybe we ought to stop thinking so much instead of how can I shower the wealthy with even more in tax breaks, and start to ask a different question, which is kind of how can we create a more fair, equitable system, and then how can we incentivize people to get ownership in that way? I think we lean on the capital gains lever way too much, and we create a lot of distortion in trying to reorient income away from earned into capital gain to take advantage of that preferential tax treatment.
How about the mom and pop manufacturing firm in a small town that's going to sell for $1.5 million? How do we help them, incentivize them to think about employee ownership?
So we often get these hypotheticals, and my favorite of these hypothetical was used to justify the 2003 Bush tax cut, which was a single mom who was a waitress who made $35,000 a year in income and $10,000 a year in interest and dividends. And I just want to understand who this woman is, who's bussing tables for $20 an hour while simultaneously having a 6-figure or more interest and dividend windfall portfolio that's generating that much in returns. So I'd love to know this mom and pop manufacturing, which is usually a capital intensive industry, and I'm sure and the prevalence of that versus the actual situation, which was, do you know who was the big winner of that capital gains? Was a small business owner named Dick Cheney, who got windfalls of hundreds of thousands of dollars of reduced capital taxes from the 2003 tax cut. So, you could go back and forth on this in that regard, but I often think people paint very favorable hypotheticals, which when you then step back and say, okay, well, what's the prevalence of this type of person versus the prevalence of the people who are going to use that policy to their financial advantage, and you see a big mismatch.
Any other reactions to that question? It's hard to follow an Aaron Klein on this. Well, I want to end here by expressing my thanks to this team. It was a year plus of work. It takes a lot to coordinate the types of efforts, both of those that are on this stage, but also those that are engaging with this work along the way. Again, we have 500 plus employees who have filled that survey, 200 plus and growing owners who have gone through this work, and countless people who I've sent a Google Doc to be able to give feedback and comments along the way. But the ability to convene in this way around important ideas, I think I heard Mike reference it as the Tsunami. Was that what I heard on the side? Suzanne. Okay, we're going to work on that piece over time. But a really important societal question that's going to raise important questions both for policymakers and also for business school academics like many of us. So grateful to you all, and we hope to continue this conversation moving forward. Thank you.